Welcome to the Storypowers podcast, a show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, Francisco Mafuz. My guest today is John Livesay, also known as the Pitch Whisperer. John is a sales keynote speaker and shares the lessons learned from his award-winning sales career at Conde Nast. He's the author of Better Selling Through Storytelling, has been interviewed by none other than Larry King, and his TEDx talk has had more than 1 million views. He is also the nicest salesperson you ever meet. If you like the show, please leave us an iTunes review and subscribe. It really helps other people find us. And yes, I'm sure you've heard that before, but what can I say? We podcasters have always depended on the kindness of strangers. Ladies and gentlemen, John Livesay. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Francisco. I hope I can live up to being the nicest salesperson you ever meet.
I don't think it's a very high bar to cross. but no, I mean that sincerely, because I've started reading your book recently, and that's very much the feeling you get from most of your stories. And the other funny thing was I started reading the book and I thought, this sounds a little familiar. And then I realized why. And so I went back and watched your TEDx talk again. And I realized that the beginning or the first story you tell in the book is almost word for word the TEDx talk. And that was my first question.
Yes.
Has it been your experience that a good story works as well when it's written other than told?
A good story works, period. And you want to be known for having a few signature stories as a brand. And I've explored this a lot. And other speakers have said, they have their keynote that they're known for, and people take 2 or 3 stories away, hopefully, if they remember them and they're great. And then they might hear the speaker again. And if the speaker doesn't tell that story again, they miss it. And we think as speakers, I have to have completely new content. And I learned this from listening to Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and now Big Magic. And I heard her speak. And then I read her book and I thought, oh my gosh, this story that she told in her talk is almost, as you said, word for word in the book.
Oh, it's having your greatest hits to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think I've heard either Jay Baer or someone on Jay Baer's podcast refer to the same, that if they get just so disappointed, the audience, if the story they heard 5 years ago is not there. That's really interesting, because I think the natural thinking would be, no, have everything new so you're not repeating content, but clearly not. And also on your TEDx talk, I mean, starting TEDx talks or TED Talks with a story has become almost a cliche, but yours doesn't only start with a story. Yours is almost only a story. There's some other things in there, but almost all of it is a story. Again, this might sound like a bit of a softball question, but why did you take that approach instead of something that a little more common for TED?
Well, I actually hired a TEDx organizer to be my TEDx coach, because giving a TEDx talk is very different than a normal keynote to a room full of salespeople, for example. And we really crafted stories within stories. And what are the takeaways from a story, not just to tell a story for the story's entertainment's sake. So there was a lot of thought and structure that went into the whole thing as a journey. And within that journey, there'll be multiple stories and we reverse engineer it. We actually start, and I think this is great advice for anybody, whether you're telling a story or giving a talk, whether it's a TEDx talk or a keynote, start at the end of your talk, reverse engineer it. And he had me answer these 3 questions. What do I want the audience to feel at the end? What do I want them to think at the end? And what do I want them to do at the end of my talk? And so we started at the end with those 3 answers, and that's how the whole thing came together.
I've heard many TEDx organizers and people that are involved with helping speakers talk about how what you just described is one of the hardest parts of dealing with anyone that has experience. You seem to have gone the opposite way. You went and looked for a coach. Where a lot of people I know, I mean, I'm a TEDx coach as well, where I started being one this year, and a lot of the organizers say that most speakers don't understand they're going to be coached, don't want to be coached, and are very resistant to the idea of being coached. And it's interesting that someone who does this for a living will immediately say, no, actually, I need a coach. I'm not doing all of this by myself.
Well, I tell you, that experience was quite intense because they have you take things apart. My TEDx talk is be the lifeguard of your own life. And I talk about my own disruption and embracing it. And ironically, that's more important now with the quarantine than ever. But at the time, it didn't seem nearly as intense or social impact as many of the other people in the class that I was taking on it. Social impact, big stories of, making a difference in the world, which are all great. And I love those. But mine was a little more business focused. And during the process, they have you move things around, as you know, start and stop, cut that story, add this. And I thought to myself, man, I feel like a beginner here. And then by the end of the weekend, they had a live rehearsal, and we did it. And this is just for the class. This isn't the actual TEDx experience. And we did it. Then they gave us some more notes, and they gave me like 6 things to change. And that's when my experience kicked in. I know how to memorize something quickly. I was able to redo it. And when I went up to do it, so they were filming it so I'd have some footage to submit to TEDx, all my experience came to play. So I think it's a really great lesson for everyone, A, to stay coachable no matter how experienced you are, and B, just be willing to let things fall apart before you put them back together.
Yeah, and I think that part of the issue that a lot of people have with that is an inability to, as they say in the writing world, kill their darlings.
Yeah,
the story is so precious to you that, no, but this part is really important. No, but that doesn't work. Oh, but I like it so much.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I did notice, and because I've seen parts of your keynote speech, and I've heard you on the podcast, and the one thing that I know a lot of TEDx coaches struggle with, the biggest challenge is to coach someone, improve their speech, but not change their voice.
Yeah.
Is have them sound like themselves at the end of it. And perhaps because I've seen other things of you, but to me, that just sounded 100% John Livesay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they didn't sound like someone had their fingers in that a lot. So, credit to the coach, I guess.
Yes, Mark Lovett is his name. He lives in Lisbon now. So yes, it was fantastic.
So how do you find that compares, so this experience of putting together a TED Talk to putting together a keynote? What would you say are the major differences with regards to how you have to balance stories and content and entertainment and all of that?
Well, the first difference is the length of time. Typically TEDx talks are 12 to 18 minutes, and typically a keynote is 60, sometimes 45. So obviously you have to have a lot more content. And I just recently did one for Olympus Medical, and it was a virtual keynote. And that was the first time I've done that. And let me tell you, that's a very different experience than being in front of a live audience, because everyone's on mute. There's 250 people, and you have no feedback, no energy, no laughs. So you really have to refocus the way you're delivering the talk. And what I did was I went through my talk and made sure that every 10 minutes there was some kind of engagement going on. I didn't expect them to look at me on Zoom for an hour without any kind of engagement. So I had trained some of the salespeople on how to turn a boring case study into a case story so that I could call on them during a keynote, which is not something you typically do at a keynote. But it was one of the highlights of the talk, because I would explain a concept of storytelling as a sales tool, and then I'd have somebody who worked with them that they knew give an example of it. So it required a lot more preparation. I also had breakout rooms during the keynote where 5 or 6 people out of the 250 would go into a short little breakout room and work on something and then come back. And then I made my slides much more animated, literally with animation, something moving. And I put in a lot more movie clips than I normally do. Again, because when we're watching something, our brain is going, is this a commercial or is this entertainment? And so I turned the sound off on some of the movie clips and would speak to what's going on if they were famous movie clips. Like, here's what oh, wow. Unless there's a moment in a movie clip where someone's taking a very long pause and I'm trying to teach them to be comfortable with silence, then I'll play that clip.
It sounds like the biggest difference in your approach to the virtual keynote to what would probably be the case on stage is that the weight of keeping the audience's attention has to be significantly less on you. It has to be distributed between all these different things that I know a lot of keynote speakers don't particularly like. I mean, I'm not a big fan of slides. I'll use them because you have to use them to a certain degree, but I'll try to use them as little as possible. And I don't think normally there is a great deal of engagement. There wouldn't typically be breakout sessions unless it's a workshop.
Right.
But 1 hour is a very long time.
And they actually asked me to make my keynote an hour and a half because they wanted me to add 30 minutes of content to teach these outside salespeople how to sell on Zoom. So the keynote became almost like a mini workshop. And then I did a workshop the next day. So it's an interesting process, as opposed to the keynote and then the workshop follows right away. You can't expect people to sit that long on a Zoom call like they can in the room. But even when I give talks in person, you're moving around. There's something to look at on the stage. So, and I have the audience stand up and do some things, and even just crossing your arms one way and then crossing your arms another. You can still do those things. But my real big difference between a TEDx talk, which is for evergreen content, ideally, versus a keynote is it must be customized to that audience. I reference people's names that I've talked to. I talk about their specific industry. I gave a talk to Anthem Insurance, and afterwards someone said, "Oh, how long have you worked in healthcare?" And I said, I haven't. I just took the research and the time to prepare and customize the talk to you.
Out of curiosity, were you sitting or standing?
Standing. And that's one of the tips I give when I'm teaching people how to be good on Zoom is I have this soundbite: stand up and dress up. And they went, "Oh my God, none of us are standing up when we're talking to our clients." It totally changes your energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have that as a bit of a battle between the two things, because 100% standing is way better from an energy point of view. But I've now seen a lot of people be very good with using the screen. So they're using either props or their hands or their proximity to the screen. And that is very difficult to do standing unless you have a very professional filming setup that allows you to get close and far.
Right.
So I've seen the benefits and the advantages of both sides. And with the sound that you mentioned, I think I'm waging a one-man crusade in trying to convince people whenever I do anything online to unmute themselves. Mm-hmm. Because I'll say I'll take the noise if that means I get the feedback.
Yes.
But I understand.
Well, there's a lot of distractions, that's for sure. There's photo bombing from the kids, there's doorbells, there's dogs barking, and 250 people unmuted would really be distracting for me.
Yeah, I think that it's doable to a certain degree with smaller groups, but with 250 people, I understand that doesn't work. But just the idea of trying to do much humor, which is something I try to, without any audible feedback is just, you could be bombing and you don't necessarily know you're bombing.
Right.
Again, probably feels better than if you are actually bombing and there's just that silence. So a lot of your career, because you mentioned that you didn't work in healthcare, and I know a lot of your career was in the advertising space. Mm-hmm. And this is something I was curious about, because I've seen you give examples of how brands use storytelling or typical stories in their brands, but what they're not doing is, they're not telling a story. They're using elements of a story. So that's something I just wanted you to talk about a bit, the difference between the sort of short form storytelling that brands do compared to when you actually tell a story.
Adweek interviewed me recently to give my feedback and opinion on which of the Super Bowl commercials were using storytelling to the best advantage. And so I talk about the different genres of storytelling, and you can start to identify, oh, that brand is using that genre. One of my favorite Super Bowl commercials was Google, because they're making a story about a man who's older. He just recently lost his wife and he's losing his memory, and he uses the Google tools to Google what was her favorite song? What was our favorite movie? And then ironically, they cut to a scene from Casablanca where they're saying goodbye. And so they're tugging at the heartstrings multiple ways. The feeling of watching that scene in the movie, and then how Google is helping this man keep his emotional connection to his wife. So there's stories within the stories, all within a Super Bowl commercial of 30 seconds. So I thought that was some really great use of storytelling for a brand.
Because what I've seen you refer to is, I think the examples you used were, one was definitely Expedia. Mm-hmm. Using the example of the trip, and sometimes it's just a line. And if you know the reference, which is, I think with the Expedia one is the typical story of going on a trip and coming back and then telling people about it.
Yes.
But, they're tapping into that story archetype, which, if I'm not crazy, this is from Christopher Booker's famous book of the 7 basic plots.
Right, and The Wizard of Oz is the classic example of that.
But that is a very condensed, short form of storytelling, isn't it? I mean, a lot of the things that I know most storytellers would want to have in a story to have its full impact are not present there. You just don't have it's just not available to you. Mm-hmm. Have you found that is just a completely different type of storytelling? How do they balance those things out?
Well, the goals of an advertising campaign are very different than the goals of a keynote speaker to an audience. So the goal of an advertising campaign is first to break through the clutter, which storytelling does. And secondly, to have an emotional connection to the brand, to get people to remember it. And that's why they run them so many times, is they have to keep that frequency going so that you take some action.
And one other question that comes often whenever I tell people about storytelling and about what I'm doing, the question that always comes is yeah, it's fine if you're on stage, but if you're in a one-on-one situation, if you're in a pitch, if you're having a meeting with your boss, I got this one last week. If you're in a meeting with your boss, how do you introduce a story to that conversation without that coming across very weird? I don't imagine there's a better person in the world to ask that question. So,
well, I tell people, if you want to go from being seen as an annoying pest, whether it's to your boss or someone you're pitching to, like medical people have to call on doctors, and be seen as a welcome guest. So you see the contrast, annoying pest to welcome guest?
Yes.
Storytelling will make you a welcome guest, as opposed to pushing out a bunch of information or asking for something. So the people who are storytellers are like, it's like going on a ride at an amusement park. You're like, oh, I'm going to be entertained. This is going to be fun. It taps into a different side of our brain, as opposed to, let me analyze this. I have to solve something else. Oh, you have a story to tell me? I'm in. And it doesn't have to be so direct. You just start telling the story. You know what? You're never going to believe what just happened to me on the way to work. And suddenly we're in this situation, and I had this idea, but I know that we're going to be struggling about this. Maybe this happens to you when you're in the shower. It's so funny how ideas come to us in unexpected places. Anyway, and then you get into what the solution is. A very different kind of conversation than, I've been thinking about this problem and I've used my critical skills and I've come up with a solution and I'd like to give you a presentation on it.
I mean, I'm sure there are people that actually sound like what you just did there. Mm-hmm. But I think for us that are perhaps used to slightly more fluid type of communication, it's difficult to believe that anyone thinks that ever makes sense.
Well, it's so funny. I work with a lot of people of, like you said, be authentic, be yourself. And when that camera goes on a TEDx talk, or when I've done live TV, or someone has asked to shoot a video, or just get up in front of a room and present, people become robotic. They go, well, my natural personality and I have to be this formal person. And that's not at all what makes people connect. And so storytelling can really help people relax and be authentic.
It's funny you just said that because a few days, 2-3 days ago, I was going to post something on social media, and there's always these people that police what other people do on social media. Mm-hmm. This is appropriate, this is not appropriate, or whatever. And then I was just like, I don't want to just complain because it's just boring. So how do I do this in a more entertaining fashion? So I just wrote down that I walked into the meeting room and I shook his hand. And there was no expression on his face. And I sat down and I started getting a feeling this meeting wasn't going to go well. And I really needed it to go well. And I looked around. I mean, is there anything personal here that I can use for small talk? A book, a trophy, pictures of this family. There was nothing. And that's when I realized who I had just met. The professional man.
Or Darth Vader. Yeah.
And then I went on to talk about how the professional man has no sense of humor. He never uses slang. He just, he's always by the book. But in my experience, that person doesn't exist. This is a myth that a lot of people believe in, that there is this business people that are all about business. They don't crack jokes. They don't have a personal life. They have no sense of humor. But to me, this is a myth, but perhaps I've just been lucky in my life that I haven't.
Well, comparing it to Darth Vader would really bring that to life for people, because they would be, we know what, I am your father. It taps, because Star Wars is all about the myth of using the
Heroes,
storytelling genres. So
yeah.
if you paint a picture that somebody can instantly get a visual of, I felt like I was presenting to Darth Vader. That makes that story that much more dramatic. And what I loved about what you did there was I really needed this meeting to go well. You've painted a picture that the stakes are high. And that's what people need to learn about really good storytelling is there's got to be a little bit of drama in that problem. The stakes have to be high for us to be interested in it, to see what happens. If it's like, I don't care if this meeting goes well or not, it was like, who cares? Right? But if I need this meeting to go well and it's not, now we're in, tell me what happens next.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't have stakes, I mean, it could still be a story. It's just not a very interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't care what happens, why would we?
Right. Well, I have an example of helping somebody take some really informational things and that they typically would say in a case study or some boring presentation. They were saying, our equipment is 30% faster than another competitor. And I was saying to them, there's no story there. And there's no emotional connection to that. So what does that even mean? What's the typical surgery? 2.5 hours. So 30% faster is what? It's done in an hour and a half. So I said, okay, so here's how we turn that into a case story. Imagine how happy the doctor is that he can go out to the patient's family who's in the waiting room where every minute feels like an hour earlier than normal, and let them know their loved one made it. They got chills from that because that's not how they're selling their product. But the minute you start painting that picture, and guess who's the hero in the story? It's not the client with the machine. It's the doctor who gets to go out to the patient's family. So that's what I love about storytelling as a sales tool.
I've seen a lot of people try and twist what was usually the way stories were told, in the sense that temptation for everyone telling it is to make themselves the hero. Or if it's a company, the company is the hero, the product is the hero. No.
Right.
The company, the customer is the hero, the company is the guide.
Yep.
So the company is Yoda or Gandalf or whoever, Mr. Miyagi. But not, in that case, again, the pain of the patients or the patient's family is the real problem. And that's what you're fixing, is not, the surgery is a bit short or what. So the doctor can go play golf first, earlier.
Or do another surgery and make more money.
Yeah,
it's all fine. But, then if you're talking to another doctor, then the doctor hopefully sees himself in that story and says, I want to go on that journey that other doctor got to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why I became a doctor.
As I mentioned, I started reading your book recently, and the good thing about reading books written by storytellers is that they should be a very good read, and yours is. If they are not a good read, then you probably should stop after the first chapter.
Yeah.
And there's a story you mentioned there about Martin. I don't know if you pronounce that, because the Dutch name, yeah.
Yep.
So Martin, who had survived 2 weeks by himself in the Amazon as a young man, and how you helped him use that in his investment.
Don't forget the naked part.
Okay, sorry. How he used that in his investor pitch. And the thing that struck me about that story, I mean, it's a very powerful story, but if that was my story, every single person I know in the world would know the story and would have gotten tired of hearing me tell about my 2 weeks naked in the Amazon. And you had to pry it out of him.
Yes.
And
work on it. Yes. Because if it's a rite of passage in his culture. And I kept saying, if you don't say that, it sounds like child abuse.
I'm Brazilian. I don't know if you know that. I am Brazilian. I started try to figure out which is this culture. Maybe I should.
Yeah. Where in South America is that? Yes.
What I was thinking about that was, why do you think it is so difficult for most people, I think, to find their own stories? Why do they not recognize that their life experiences? And again, this is perhaps a bad example because this is so obviously an amazing story.
Well, if you've lived it, it's not obvious to you. I think the analogy is it's very hard to see the outside of the label of a bottle if you're in the bottle.
Okay.
And that's why people need coaches and consultants. They're outside the bottle and they can say, you just ask enough questions. Okay, there's a good story. And I actually gave Martin an exercise to help his confidence, where I have people write down 2 or 3 times when they knew they nailed something, where they were certain that they were better. You ask your wife out on a first date, you got a second date, right? You've got a job, whatever, and in his case, one of his moments of certainty was this experience, but he hadn't thought about it in years. So it's we sometimes forget stories. So helping people dig up the stories from their past, the story of origin is almost always interesting.
Yes, it's also fantastic how when you start getting more practice into it, how everything starts looking more like a story. I've committed, because I'm trying to keep my storytelling chops as sharp as they can, and I've now committed to I'm putting every single week a story on social media. So I'm filming something a minute or two, and then you start finding them. You remember things, and then I do the ultimate test, which is I tell it to my 3-year-old daughter. And now my wife gets sort of baffled. She's like, "What is this story she's going on about? The bad boss?" I was like, "Oh, sorry, that was that story when I completely lost my temper and shouted at my employee." So every single week she gets a new story, and she tends to like them. And as long as it's a story and I've put all the elements in there, she likes them, and she doesn't want to read the normal books. She just wants a story, which to me is, it shouldn't be surprising anymore.
Right. Well, look at children. They love to hear the Little Red Riding Hood over and over again, right? The big bad wolf, and you've just turned it into the big bad boss. Let's go over what makes a good story, what the 4 elements are, because I think that'll help everybody listening. So let's go back to the Martin example. The actual story sounds like this. Martin was born in South America, but he grew up in the Netherlands. And when he turned 18, his parents took him back to South America and dropped him off in the Amazon jungle naked to survive for 2 weeks, because in his culture, that's a rite of passage into manhood. And I said, wow, that's a good story. What lessons did you learn in the Amazon jungle? He goes, well, I sure learned how to focus and pivot and persevere. I said, great. We're going to take those lessons from the Amazon jungle into the concrete jungle of being an entrepreneur. And when he had that story practiced, he got his startup funded because the investor said, this guy will figure out any problems in business if he survived that. So the elements of that story are the exposition, the who, what, where, when. As I said earlier, if he doesn't say it's a rite of passage, it sounds like child abuse. So you got to paint that picture. The problem is very obvious. He's naked there for 2 weeks. The solution is not only does he survive, but he learns some life lessons. And the secret sauce to a really great story, Francisco, is the resolution. What happened to him after surviving? That he was able to get a startup funded. And that's what most people's stories don't have. And that's why if you look at The Wizard of Oz, there's definitely a resolution in that movie when she comes home. And you were there, and you were there, and there's no place like home. All these life lessons that were learned.
I think The Lord of the Rings is probably a very extreme example of that, because the whole thing finishes and you think, okay, we're done. And then there is another 100 pages, I think, in the book about Frodo going back home, and then all that stuff that goes on. I mean, to some people, that's a lot more interesting than what went on before. But yeah, and I guess that for anyone trying to use storytelling in business, if you don't have the resolution, you might be taking the chance that whoever is listening to your story is going to get the wrong message out of it. Because if you haven't made it clear what you've taken to your normal life, you just have this Amazon story, and they might just read something different into it, perhaps.
Right. Yes.
Okay. So let me ask you, because I haven't seen anywhere. I mean, again, I haven't finished your book, but I've seen other things from you, and I've never really seen where you've learned this stuff. I know you've had a career in sales, but at no point I've seen you say, this is who taught me. This is when I learned.
Well, before I got a career selling advertising to big brands like Lexus and Guess Jeans, I worked at an ad agency editing movies into commercials that were coming out on DVD back in the day. And so I learned the elements of how to take a 2-hour movie and cut it down to a 30-second commercial, and how we could look at what had been done theatrically to get people to go see it in the movie theater. Maybe it wasn't a hit in the movie theater. And so if we re-edited and told the story of that movie in a different way, people might want to go rent or buy it on DVD. So that's really where I started to learn, and then I just watched a lot of other successful salespeople, and some of them were telling stories and were always welcomed. So I just started watching what's going on. What's the difference between really successful people who people can't wait to see and those who are bored and check out?
Fair enough. I think movies seem to be the place that a lot of people that are into storytelling learn their craft. I keep running across people that worked in cinema or just big movie fans, and that seems to be a recurring theme. And something else that, I mean, it should have been obvious to anyone who's been paying attention to the words you've been using since we started. But I've noticed how you put a lot of stock into using, well, metaphor obviously, but I think most people just think of catchy lines, right? So the I think the one you used recently was annoying guest to welcome guest.
Annoying pest, yes.
Annoying pest to welcome guest. Yes. I think what's the other one I've heard you use? The tug at the heartstrings to open
to get people purse strings. Yes, exactly.
Okay. And the one I really like, and this one I will definitely be stealing. I'll try to remember to give credit, but I'll definitely be stealing. Is one I've seen you use at the TED Talk, which was that mastering your fear wasn't about getting rid of your butterflies, but getting them to fly information. I mean, that yes. I think that's beautiful, and that one I'm pretty sure will stay with me for quite a while. And so my question to you was, do you ever thought of metaphor as a condensed version of storytelling?
Sure. It's a way for us to tap into real estate that's already in our brain. So when I tell people I'm known as the pitch whisperer, automatically we go, wait a minute. I know what a horse whisperer is. What's a pitch whisperer? So our brain's always looking for something new to hook into and compare it to something that it already knows. That's why when you're describing calling on somebody who was so cold, and I said, oh, like Darth Vader. So my brain is just trained to look for ways to help lock that in for people to understand it in a different way.
I'm not sure I should tell you this, but I will anyway. For my generation, I'm slightly younger than you. It's not the horse whisperer that we think of. It's the dog whisperer.
That's fine. Whatever it is.
Cesar Milano.
Yes, he's fantastic. Yes, I have a dog. So I've studied his work. And well, much like a dog whisperer, horse whisperer, it works with people on their confidence level, right? Calming people down, whether it's your dog barking or the horse, is getting scared. So if people go, oh, you help people be confident and calm down when they have to pitch by telling them to be a storyteller and relax. Okay, now I totally get what you do.
It's an amazing term, and it's no surprise you trademarked it. Someone is bound to steal that. And the last thing I wanted to ask you is, again, we were talking about the catchy things, and another one which you use, and it's actually the name of a program I think you put out this year, which is the Go From Invisible to Irresistible. Now, Was it just coincidence that you have this whole web-based learning program to come out at the time we're all stuck at home, or have you been working on it, or did you just pivot really fast?
No, I've been working on it for 6-7 months, and it just happened to be finished right at the time when the quarantine started. And I tell you, it was a really wonderful thing. And this is another takeaway for people listening. You can give yourself like a stock and invest your money in yourself. You know your own work ethic. You believe in yourself, hopefully. And when you have a choice of, I'm going to invest in creating this online course. And once I create it, then I'll figure out how to promote it. And I may or may not feel like this was a good decision, but I want to do it. And I know people want it. Then ironically, when I was going up for that big speaking job I was talking about, and it was between me and another speaker, I had the online course to offer in addition to as a part of the follow-up to my talk and workshop. And they loved it. They said, ooh, we also want to get additional 75 copies of your book and the online course for the new hires that we have budgeted after the sales meeting is over. So it really became a great, great way for me to get more speaking engagements. And now a lot of people are loving it because it's short little modules and it lets you get in and out. And it's a nice little refresher. And there's some quizzes afterwards. And, our brain craves progress. And so after you've completed the whole thing, you get a little certificate saying, congratulations, you're a revenue rock star now. Well, that's a great tool for Olympus Medical to manage the 250 salespeople and say, send us a copy of your certificate so we know you went through it. And that, because they're committed to having storytelling be part of their sales culture. So it's really a fun way to reinforce it in a way that, busy people can go, oh, I got 10 minutes to watch this module. And then, I can complete this in a short amount of time, and I can go back and get a refresher. So it's, it just happened to be something that because I don't think you should try to whip something together because it'll damage your brand. So, I had to spend time creating it, just like the book, had somebody film me, then put graphics on it. Then there's clips of movies as I'm speaking. So that lifeguard story again gets repurposed once again, the TEDx, the book, and now in the online course. And so when I'm describing that, you actually hear the lifeguard whistle. You hear the sound of the water splashing. So it's a different way to bring that story to life.
And I think timing wise, it's fantastic that you managed to bring it out now, because from everyone that I've been speaking to, and James Taylor, who we mentioned earlier, was one of them, it's very clear that we are probably not going to see the speaking world, at least, go back to anything resembling what we understand as normal for, I don't know, another year, 18 months. And even when it does go back, there's still likely to be a big appetite for virtual conferences, for online products. So I think that you're right. I don't think anyone should try and throw something together just to ride the wave. But a year down the line, I think anyone who doesn't have that sort of thing in their arsenal is really going to struggle, because again, we don't know how long we're in this for. But I think a lot of the changes are likely to stay in place for a while. And just one last question I wanted to ask you is: are you missing the stage already?
Oh yes, I miss the energy, and I miss hugs. Most of all, just listening to you describe about going to shake somebody's hand in your earlier story, and I thought, will that go away? Who knows? So I miss the hugs, and I miss the face-to-face contact for sure. So we'll all going to get through this. It just makes us appreciate things in a whole new way. I think, like getting a haircut is suddenly now a luxury.
Where can people find you?
Well, on Twitter, I'm at John_Livesay, L-I-V as in Victor, E-S-A-Y. On Instagram, I'm the Pitch Whisperer. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. And if you go to my website, which is just my name, johnlivesay.com, you can get a free sneak peek of my book.
And for everyone, I'm going to put all those links in the show notes. And I'm also going to put a link to John's new sales storytelling program, Better Selling Through Storytelling. That's the name of the program, right? And the website is Go From Invisible to Irresistible, which is quite cool as well. John, you've had more than one celebrated career. You've been interviewed with Larry King. And when I asked you to come on the show, it took you about 30 seconds to say yes. That, to me, is a big testament to the kind of person you are and your generosity. So I wanted to give you my sincere thanks. It's been absolutely amazing having you on.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. And I know you're going to be a great host and a great speaker. I can't wait to see you on a stage sometime, and we'll share it together.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And until next time.